the settlement at the Paris Peace was to implement the ideas put forth by Wilson, this idea of having a League of Nations. Remember, they want to discuss this new treaty as being a rational treaty and trying to prevent future war. And it was often thought that internationalism could prevent warfare, that possibly they could end wars in the world. They could just have cooperation and a path to resolve differences without the use of violence. What happened in Europe was seen as devastating, and millions of dead and millions of wounded soldiers, and there was a belief and a hope that international spirit could change things. So the League of Nations is developed, and again, this isn't something else that it's often maligned as the League of Nations failed to stop World War, Hitler, and then therefore World War II began. And again, we're going to try to get rid of these simplistic notions. The League of Nations had way too much on its plate. There was many different parts to the League of Nations, and we're not going to get into all the details of it, but part of it was to deal with some occupied regions, for example, on the Saar and Danzig, and try and hold the peace in these areas, which was a terrible kind of mission to be given, because they didn't have the manpower or the money to handle conflict in such regions. What it did have was a forum and a format for nations to come and try to handle disputes. And when nations wanted to be cooperative and wanted this kind of venue, then it was very successful. For example, Finland and Sweden had disputes over certain islands called the Åland Islands, and it went to the League of Nations to try and determine something that could be justified in terms of who would possess these islands, and it was resolved. When Greece had a civil war and there was unrest in Greece, 1925, the League of Nations did very well to settle some of the disputing parties in this case. It was not capable of mass movements against populations. And today, the same weaknesses that we might point to with the United Nations occurred really with the League of Nations as well. You have to have the big players all on board on the same issue, and with the same force and willingness and money and manpower and such to enforce certain regulations or to slap a nation down or etc. The League of Nations didn't have that capability. It was never built in with that capability. It was not created to have any kind of security force. As you may know, Wilson, when he returns with the treaty, the Paris Peace Treaty, the U.S. Congress refuses to sign the treaty, and refuses then therefore to participate in the League of Nations. So the League is hampered especially by the economic power of the U.S. to help support such a new organization. One of the things, another way it did have some success was that it tried to intervene on humanitarian and refugee crises that were happening in Central and Eastern Europe. Following the Russian Revolution, more than 1 million people had fled the Soviet Union looking for places to stay. Many of them were without passports and paperwork that was becoming ever more necessary in European affairs. And one of the people who helped solve this crisis was a leading member of the League of Nations, Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian. who later gets the Nobel Prize for his efforts. And one of the readings you have in this Unit 2 folder deals with this, and you need to take a look at this and read about these Nansen passports. But briefly, it was a way for people who were without internal paperwork to move to different nations and to be accepted by different nations as a refugee. And it was underfunded. And when we look to what happened in terms of the Holocaust and those who were trying to escape Germany and other occupied lands during World War II, it's a shame that more of these types of passports were not issued, because one of the greatest barriers for Jews trying to escape Europe was that they had no passports and they had no country willing to issue paperwork or to allow them to seek refuge in their nation. And the U.S., there's a famous case, for example, when a boatload on a cruise ship arrives in the U.S. and they're turned away, and those people are later die in the Holocaust because the U.S. refused to expand its immigration policy during the war. So, but one of the successes of the League of Nations is that you have such an international refugee policy, a policy that might help feed people in dire circumstances. That's one of the other things the League of Nations was successful at, getting food, especially to Central and Eastern Europeans who were under starvation conditions following World War I. Getting food, or helping get food to Russia in 1921 when there was a great famine. And there were commissions set up to help homeless children and orphan children from the war. So the League of Nations established some international humanitarian organizations that would then be later transferred to the United Nations. So this is somewhat a success. But to blame the League of Nations for failing to stop something is to blame an organization that was never given the charge or the manpower to have such a mission, nor did they pretend to have such a mission in Europe. So again, we have to be very careful about past historiography about this time period. There's a lot of kind of quick blame that is thrown out, especially in U.S. textbooks that have been refuted by documents for a very long time, but are still repeated again and again. Unfortunately, and this is the case in the U.S., that very few people have questioned what has been said before, and especially in American high schools. And this is how you might have learned initially about this region and this time period. So we want to be careful. So the League of Nations has this spirit of internationalism. It's going to eventually bring in many powers, for example, the Soviet Union and Germany and Italy, and those that are considered dangerous right when World War II begins. They're brought in with the spirit of international cooperation, and it expands to be a very large list of nations. The problem, again, is going to be the Great Depression, and the Great Depression is going to have nations or countries look internally and saying, we can't help others, we need to only help ourselves. And the spirit of internationalism quickly dies with the Great Depression, and tariffs are raised and trade barriers are raised following the Great Depression, which we'll discuss in a later unit. But the spirit of internationalism in the early 1920s is full of hope, full of promise that world crises can be solved if the nations and the peoples of the world work together. And there are some limited successes that can be pointed to, and I believe that generally humanitarian efforts that were made during this time period probably are the greatest successes of that organization.